Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. My name is Samantha Leanne and I talk about books. February is over. I know, it's really crazy, right? So in February, I read 11 books, which is the same amount as January. And with this being a shorter month, I kind of didn't expect the number to be that high, but here we are. So I have 11 books to talk about. I'm actually going to be splitting this video up into two parts. So you are currently watching part one of my February wrap up. So without further ado, let's just go ahead and start talking about the books. Book number one this month was Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. This book was a 3-star read for me. It is a classic and I kind of struggle with classics. I found the narrative to be pretty boring sometimes. I didn't really find many of the characters actually likable, with the exception of one, and it wasn't so much that I liked him so much as I liked him more than most of the other characters. However, it was really interesting in the sense of kind of exploring personal freedom and just a couple of other like socially relevant topics, especially considering the political climate and everything that we're in today. So while it wasn't my favorite book and there were definitely things that I didn't like about it, I still feel like it's important. So I would recommend reading it. So the next book that I read was actually on audio. This was Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman, and it was narrated by him, which I absolutely loved. I've listened to several of his books that he has narrated himself, and I just really enjoy the sound of his voice. This wasn't my favorite Gaiman, but it's definitely still worth reading. The writing is really engaging and descriptive, and I found myself really immersed into the setting, and some of the settings and some of the characters were really creepy. He did a really good job conveying that, so like I could close my eyes and I could see these things and I could feel like I was there, which is really what you want in a good audiobook, because I've listened to some that it's just been like shit. I think that had a lot to do with the writing as well as the narration, but this is a fantasy, and there is this concept of London above and London below. And I'm not going to go into any further detail than just talking about that, but I feel like the whole London above and London below thing was kind of a parallel to talking about homelessness, and I did appreciate that parallel. If I'm right, I could be completely wrong on that, but it's just kind of how I interpreted that. As well as we have our main character who is completely ordinary. He's just like, he lives this average life, and I kind of really liked how the way that everything went about in the book, that one simple act of kindness can kind of have a reverberating effect and can catapult you into something great. So all of those things, I gave this book 4 stars. Like I said, it's definitely a good read, especially if you like fantasy. If you have read Gaiman and you enjoy his work and you haven't read this one yet, I definitely recommend reading it. And the next book that I finished was The Final Empire, Mistborn #1 by Brandon Sanderson. This was a buddy read with Jess and Christina from Game of Tomes. I will put an info card up above. Definitely check them out. They are absolutely wonderful. And this was my first buddy read and we had so much fun. But this is a high fantasy novel taking place in a world that we don't really know much about, but we know that there's kind of these different classes. There's the Lord Ruler above them all. There is the nobility, and then there is the lower class, which is pretty much the sky, pretty much slaves, right? So there are certain people in this world that are born with what they call allomancy, which is essentially the burning of certain metals has different effects, and not everybody can do this. So we have our two main characters, Vin and Kelsier, as well as an entire other cast, and they're gonna change some shit. That is essentially the premise of this book. This was about 3.75 stars. It's not quite 4 stars. There were things that I liked and things that I didn't. So what did I like? I liked the world building. I really liked the magic system, if you could call it that. It was easy to understand. I liked the way that it was written. It didn't just info dump you. You kind of learned a little bit as the story went on. The writing, for the most part, itself was pretty solid. There were a couple of other things about the writing that I didn't really care for, but I'll talk about that in a minute. The actual plot was interesting. There were a couple of lulls in it, but for the most part, when like the action happened, the action fucking happened, and it was like, whoa, blow your mind. The way that it ended was like, I need to know where it goes, so I will definitely be continuing on with the series. But what didn't I like about it? One of the things that I did not like is that because this is the high fantasy, it is much like A Song of Ice and Fire in that there are a lot of characters. It is not told from multiple perspectives like A Song of Ice and Fire. There's just a lot of people and there's a lot of stuff. But because there are so many people, you don't really get like a really good sense of any of these characters. It's just like, so there were a couple of times where they would talk about a character and I'm like, wait, what does this person do again? Like, how is this person imperative to the story? The other thing, in terms of not just the characters but the writing as well, is that there was no distinct voice of these characters. And what I mean by that is, especially during dialogue scenes, it's like, okay, this person's talking to this person. There wasn't really a distinction. So you were kind of like, sometimes you would have to backtrack and be like, wait a minute, who started the conversation? Like who's talking to who? In addition to the fact that some of the writing was really redundant, and let me explain what I mean by that. There are certain words or certain phrases that Sanderson uses a lot. And it was like they kind of missed this during the editing process. An example of this would be one of the main characters, Ben, she grew up on the streets. And so she knows how to lay low. She doesn't like to be seen. She doesn't like being the center of attention. So during the course of the book, there were a couple of times where she sort of had to be the center of attention. And so people would be looking at her and she would squirm in her seat. And he said that like 6 or 7 or 8 times. And like every time he did, I'm like, can y'all, like, there are a million other ways to say this. Can we move on? Can we talk about something else? Or just like certain words that I would notice that he would use over and over again, like adjectives. And I'm like, that's cool that you can use a thesaurus, but you may want to use more than just the one word that you initially came up with. So, as well as there were a couple other like tropey things in there, but they didn't like detract too much from the story. The book itself, like I said, those things aside, it was good. It was pretty solid. If you are a fan of high fantasy, then I definitely recommend reading this. And I will definitely be reading the other 2 books in the series at some point. The next book that I finished was Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. This is actually a reread for me. I read it years and years ago and I wrote a paper on it in high school and I loved it. And so I was a little bit worried that it wasn't going to, you know, translate well into that reread. And I was pleasantly surprised because I love this book. This is probably my favorite classic novel of all time, in addition to like in my top 5 books of all time. I just loved it. And it was really amazing to me how on the second read through, I would notice things that I didn't notice before. And when you're reading the book for the first time, there are certain passages and certain interactions between the characters that you don't really like see the underlying thing about them until you read it through a second time. Because I found myself during a couple of scenes being like, oh, because I know what happens, I'm like, oh my God. I don't want to go into too much detail for those of you that haven't read it, but I really, really, really love this book. I think that she's published a couple of other books that people have talked about, or that I don't see anybody talk about rather. So I kind of really want to pick them up. I kind of want to see what those are all about and see if I love them as much as I love this. So yes, 5 stars. Like I love this book, so 5 stars. The next book that I'm going to talk about is Happiness Like Water by Chinelo Okparanta. This was 5 stars. Let me just start off by saying that. This is a collection of short stories where she takes us through different narratives of Nigerian-born women or men. Some are transplanted to America, some are still in their homeland, and it kind of takes us through a more intimate look into, you know, their struggles and their triumphs. The writing in this book is absolutely beautiful. And the short stories themselves, some of them, you know, could be upwards of 20 pages and some of them could be shorter than that. But it amazed me that the writing was good enough to really make me really care about the people in these short stories in the short amount of time that I was reading them. Also, be warned that this is, though the title states Happiness Like Water, this is not a book about happy things. This talks more about struggles than anything else. They are very emotional, they are very raw, and they're very powerful. Each of the stories varies in different subject matter, but even though, like I said, some of them can be very dark, the portrait of really Nigerian life, and especially that of Nigerian women, really shines through in a way that I just did not expect. This book is utterly beautiful, and I highly, highly recommend it. This book is beautiful, and I have seen no one talk about it anywhere on BookTube. I probably just haven't looked hard enough, let's be real, but I highly, highly recommend reading this. It's very good. And the last book that I'm going to talk about in this video is Nosferatu by Joe Hill. This is a solid like 3.5, 3.75 stars. I enjoyed this, but it's not quite 4 stars for a couple of different reasons. This is my 3rd Hill novel, and as you all know, I have read a ton of work by Stephen King. This book read like a Stephen King. There were so many references to a lot of his works. There were references to It, The Dark Tower, The Stand, and I'm sure that there are a couple of others that I ended up missing. While I did enjoy the content of the story, it just did not feel like Joe Hill to me. And so for that, I kind of took a little bit away from it. So as you can see, this book is kind of a chunker. I think I read this book in like 5 days. So while it is fairly long, it never really felt like it lulled, which was nice, because sometimes when you get books this long, it's like you get to the middle and you're like, all right, like, can we not? The one thing that I will say is this book is a horror book, like, let's be real about it. And the very beginning and all the way up until the middle, there was, that horror was present, and it was very, the writing style was very horrific. Like, I can't think a better way to describe it, but like that horror was there and you felt it, okay? And then by the time that we got to like the final confrontation at the end, they had been talking about these things for so long that it didn't have the same effect anymore. So it really kind of started to like lose that punch, and so, which made the ending wasn't anticlimactic, I wouldn't say. It made like that final confrontation not as impactful as it could have been, if that makes any sense. You know, because we'd already been here a couple of times already, and we'd already seen those same things. There were also a couple of things throughout this book that were discussed. For example, there's this thing called Scissors for the Drifter. They never explain what that is or like how that came into being, but it's referenced several different times. Maybe I just glazed over it, or maybe I was supposed to read between the lines and didn't. I don't really know. But there were a couple of different things that were kind of like that for me, so I didn't really care for that all that much. You know, but I liked it. I liked it. If you have never read Joe Hill, I would not start with this one. And the reason that I say that is because this, like I said, this doesn't read like a Hill. If you start here, you're not really going to get a solid idea of what Joe Hill's writing style is, because this almost feels like a tribute to his father. I believe that he just released a book called The Fireman, and I would really like to read that because I would really like to see what that looks like compared to this one. I mean, overall, it was good. It was good. If you like horror, I recommend it. Don't make it the very top of your list, but you know, it was good. I liked it. So that's all I have for you in this half of the video. If you are interested in seeing the rest of the things that I read, there is going to be a part 2. I will go ahead and link that up above. If you so desire to watch the rest of this, let's be friends on social media. You can find all of my information down below. As always, if you like this video, give it a big thumbs up and subscribe if you have not already. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you soon. Bye.